What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Pavali coming at you with another 2024-2025 NBA look ahead. We are on to the Sacramento Kings, which means I have the pleasure of speaking with the managing editor of the Kings Herald at Greg Wissinger. Follow him on Twitter at GWiss. That's at GWISS. Link to the Kings Herald as well as Greg's Twitter profile will be in the podcast and YouTube descriptions. We get into all things Sacramento Kings. It was a blast picking his brain. As always, lots of good stuff on the DeMar DeRozan fit, Keegan Murray's development, what makes Domantas Sabonis so polarizing. Before we get there, though, please remember to subscribe to this podcast if you are new around here or just haven't already. Apple, Spotify, hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Comment, like our videos, help the algo, love us back. Join our Discord. The link to that's in the podcast and YouTube description. We appreciate all the support. And if you've done all of those things, consider bumping our social promos for this, telling people about us, shouting us out elsewhere. Again, like I said, we appreciate any and all support that we get. But now let's get to talking loads and loads of Sacramento Kings with Greg Wissinger. Greg, welcome back to the HardwoodKnocks podcast. This is the 5th year I think you've done the Kings look ahead with me. I believe it's at least the 4th, but I'm pretty sure it's the 5th.
Only 5? It feels so much longer.
That's rude, but I take it. You keep coming back, so I'm going to allow it. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, always excited to have you back to talk about the Sacramento. We'll call them. I'll ascribe them to your Sacramento Kings as well as Grant's Sacramento Kings. Kings fans hate Grant. I love it.
Kings fans hate everything. So
Kings fans I've actually had some of the most positive interactions just overall on social media, which I do not use too much anymore. Mm-hmm. Has been with the Kings fan base over the past few years, I would think. Like if there were certain teams like Nuggets and Thunder fans love me because I was high on their team, like before, and now Nuggets fans probably hate me because I'm lower on their team, but Kings fans have always been like relative to the fan base. I think they've been the most fair and like engaging, like in a good way with me. So shout out to Kings fans.
We're very self-aware in our shortcomings. So I think that helps.
Well, I did call Kings fan an asshole this year, which was definitely an overreaction to what they were saying. He just caught me on a bad night.
Hey, I deserved it. It's fine. We've moved on, you know.
Yeah, you did come back. So there were some other choice words there, but I threw those in Greg's DMs. So these Kings, I want to just start with last year where they only win 2 fewer games, but they just felt so much different than that. Mm-hmm. The offense was clearly worse. What was there like? There was a ton of factors, including Kevin Huerter's play. Injuries towards the end of the season was a big one for them with Monk and Huerter out. Mm-hmm. What was just sort of like the biggest contributing factor to why they regressed so much on offense, or why last season went the way it did overall?
I think it was a combination of 2 main factors. The first one was that I just don't think they were catching people by surprise anymore.
Okay.
The people kind of knew what to expect with the Kings. You saw a lot of teams kind of scheming to take away some of the dribble handoff that the Kings had relied on so much the year before. So there was kind of an adjustment to opponents stepping up and preparing to play them seriously every night. I think the Kings themselves were also trying some new things, like trying to get away from being reliant on the dribble handoff, trying to have more effort on defense. And just the combination of all those things, a little bit of regression on some of the 3-point shooting, especially like you said, Kevin Huerter. There's a lot of things, and it was in a lot of ways a letdown to win 2 fewer games and not make it out of the play-in. But I think one of the other big factors was really just that the West was a lot better last year than the year before. Like the West was really uncharacteristically weak 2 years ago, and last year it was kind of returned to form. 48 wins 2 years ago, the Kings were the 3 seed. 46 wins last year, the Kings were in the play-in fighting for their life with other 46 and 47 win teams. So just a much harder conference, and so that it made it seem a little bit less successful of a season, even though, like I said, it really wasn't all that different, overall as far as terms of wins.
So when you look at moving into this season, I've been asking everyone so that they can take wherever they want what their biggest storyline is that they're tracking. But I feel like you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'd be interested on a pitch that's not this answer, but it's clearly just what is DeMar DeRozan's fit going to be, or how does it look with this team, right? And so where are you sort of at on all that? So just the move itself, like what was your reaction to that?
I was thrilled with the move. I mean, I think it's a great move overall, especially when you look at the cost of what the Kings gave up to get DeMar DeRozan. I mean, he is still an excellent player, even at his age. He's really good, and he brings to the table a lot of the things that the Kings were missing last year, some of the things that caused the offense to stall out. So he really solves a lot of their issues as far as needing another creator, needing someone else who can find another shot, giving them another option in the clutch. Like, it just makes them so much harder to scheme against in just one way. It gives them a lot more looks. So I'm really excited about it. And I don't feel like giving up Harrison Barnes and Chris Duarte is really very much to give up. And I think how people evaluated the loss of Harrison Barnes told me a lot this summer about who was watching the Kings and who wasn't, because there were some interesting takes flying around there. But uh, for what it cost, and the Kings still have, they didn't give up any first round picks. They still have Kevin
Shout out
Huerter,
Bulls.
who,
Shout out Bulls.
yeah, so good job, Bulls. So I mean, they still have the tools to make another move. I was hoping they would do another move this summer, but even if it's at the deadline or whenever it might be, the Kings still have the ammunition to do another move. They didn't spend every trade asset under the sun just to get DeMar DeRozan. If they had done that, I would have been a little bit more down on it. But for what it cost the team, I think it's a fantastic move. Now, there are obviously questions with it, and I think some of those questions are valid. What's the defense going to look like? How does the ball get distributed? Because now you've got a lot of guys who like the ball in their hand. I think those are good problems to have. They are things that I'm curious to see how they'll work out. But overall, I think it's a good move.
Well, looking at the positive, is there one you mentioned all that he does? Is there one thing though that like you think will end up being the most impactful, even if it's just like their free throw attempt rate plummeted last year, and like if you're not going to get to the rim, and they weren't getting to the rim as often either, to get someone from DeRozan who, he's not going to get to the basket a ton, but the dude still just draws fouls. It doesn't fucking matter.
Mm-hmm. And that's huge. I mean, the Kings last year, their leading free throw attempts per game was De'Aaron Fox at 5.7, and DeRozan gets last year was at like 8.7, I think 8.2, something like that. It was in the eights. So like, he is far and away their best at getting to the line, drawing fouls, which helps you with then getting your opponent in foul trouble. And he actually makes his free throws, which the Kings also really struggled with last year. So, he not only will get to the line, but actually makes some of those. That plus just that ability to create his own shot in isolation. The Kings didn't have a lot of that. I mean, Monk sometimes, Fox sometimes. That was about it. No one else on that team was creating their own shot in isolation, and not to the level that DeRozan can.
Are we going to see like dribble handoffs run between DeRozan and Sabonis in the paint? I just feel like they're going to be that low when they run it. I need to see it. I hope so too. That's what I don't know if that'll be the biggest impact. That's the thing I want to see the most. If you have what would be your biggest concern if you had to isolate it down about the fit? Like, what would be the potential biggest wart for you?
I would probably go with the defense. I mean, I do think that the defensive criticism against DeRozan is maybe a little overblown, because when you look at like defensive ratings and stuff like that, which obviously has a lot of team noise in there as well, but like DeRozan had a better defensive rating than Harrison Barnes last year. Like, again, Harrison Barnes was not in any way a plus defender, and so I don't know that swapping DeRozan for Barnes, I don't know how much that hurts the defense. I do think that it can cause issues depending on certain matchups. So I'm curious to see what that impact is. But I'm also kind of excited because, like, if the Kings go back to being an elite offense and can stay a middle of the pack like defense as opposed to a bottom of the pack defense, that's a pretty exciting team, and I'll be excited to root for that.
I guess, was that the take where I'm just so far removed from that silo, I guess, that they thought the Kings were losing an elite defender in Harrison Barnes or something? Is that like what the perception was?
There were some pundits that were talking about how much the Kings were going to miss Harrison Barnes' defense.
I actually think DeRozan is worse defensively than last year's version of Harrison Barnes, just because you have to go to greater lengths you have to insulate Harrison Barnes too, but the stuff that they asked him to do was just like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Where it's like with DeRozan, like, no, like he can't. Like, I just don't know. And in Chicago, to his point, was defensive rating, like he got to share the floor with Alex Caruso at points.
Yeah, absolutely.
There. So, but I don't think it's like when you look at I looked at it as, I don't know if it's a perfect offensive fit, but DeMar DeRozan is an elite offensive player, which Harrison Barnes if he ever was one. Like that's just not him. And so it's in talent. Like to me, it was a very clear upgrade. And I think I over romanticized swaps. That was the thing that gave me pause. Like that swap is really far away. And it's like, we want teams that are good to go for it now, and to give up a swap for DeMar DeRozan, who's still all-star caliber, if you want to throw him in that vein, like it is a perfectly reasonable cost. So that I'm like, I'm totally on board with the move. Who do you think will benefit most on this team, though, from him being here?
That is a good question. Like, as far as who he compliments the most?
Either compliments or makes their job easier. It's like, oh, it's like De'Aaron Fox going to take more like catch and shoot open threes or something rather than having to work so hard for his own shot. Could be something like that.
I definitely think it helps Fox the most, because it's going to do two things. Like one, DeRozan is still a willing passer and can find Fox for kickouts or whatever else. But I think more than anything, it gives you another option that the defense absolutely has to respect and pay attention to. I think there are some concerns about the spacing because DeRozan's not a deep threat, but I do think that, like, especially we saw it in late game situations, teams would just like zero in on Fox, knowing that like that's where the ball's going. It's Fox or Monk, and you don't really have to guard anyone else too close. And just one more, especially late game, close situation option who is deadly efficient, like that, I think opens up a lot of possibilities in a close game. I think that taking some of that pressure off of Fox as being the guy who has to save the team if they're down to, like that's a huge help, I think.
Do you think, this is totally anecdotal, DeMar DeRozan probably has the prettiest jumper of anyone who sucks at hitting threes? I'm just trying to think, like, who has like the aesthetics on their jumper like he does that's not been a good 3-point shooter?
Ben McLemore. Most beautiful release I've ever seen, and he betrayed us. I mean, I've got that one off the dome, but yeah.
So when you look at though the big three trio, whatever you want to call it, who do you think ends up having to make the most adjustments though because DeRozan's in town? The easy answer might just be DeRozan himself because he's the one joining a new team, but whose game do you see having to adapt the most because of the way the Kings are set up right now?
I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's actually going to be fairly spread across all of them.
Okay.
I think you're going to see like Sabonis will probably take fewer shots. Fox will probably take fewer shots. Like Monk and Huerter probably, like if everyone's taking a shot or two less per game, that gives you DeRozan shots, and he might be taking a shot or two less than he did before as well. I think it's going to be kind of an impact across the board, which could impact some of the counting stats, and then people will be like, "Oh, look, it's worse," or it hurt this guy. But if I had to focus in on one guy though, that I think is kind of the obvious candidate who would be negatively impacted, at least in his role on offense, is going to be Keegan Murray. He kind of goes from being, like the third or fourth option to being the fourth or fifth option offensively, which I think is a fair concern. But I also think that it allows him to be opportunistic, and that's how they used him in his rookie year, and he was fantastic. Is just like, all right, I can just sit here and hit open threes when the defense forgets about me. Like, that's cool. And he obviously showed a lot of development in his offense last year and ability to, kind of create his own shot. And I think long term, getting to like learn from DeRozan and practice with him every day and kind of see how he creates shots, I think that'll be beneficial long term. But I think this season probably see a little step back, at least offensively, from Keegan Murray.
If you can't tell, I'm still thinking a lot about this move months later. What like type of staggering patterns between the top players would you anticipate to have? Whereas I viewed it in terms of, I initially thought, oh, well, Fox might spend the most time independent of Sabonis and DeRozan, but then I'm like, like you have the Sabonis, like Monk chemistry. So it'll really be Sabonis maybe independent of two. Like, I'm assuming there'll be some trial and error that they'll try different stuff out. But if you had to anticipate anything on that front, what would it be?
Yeah, that's going to be the big question. I don't know what that's going to look like. Mike Brown was pretty rigid with his rotations last season, but DeRozan's a pretty big piece to then work into those. And so I'm really curious to see how that staggering works. I would not be surprised at all if we do see kind of a stagger where when Fox is coming off, Monk is going in, especially earlier in games, because Monk can still move the ball around, good distributor, but also a scoring threat. So I think Fox and Monk will play sparingly together throughout games, but will likely be in their late games still. But yeah, I'm very curious to see. I mean, I think the tricky part is that right now you're kind of penciling in DeRozan as basically the small forward, in the lineups, and they've got a lot of options that can play 1 or 2, and not a lot of options at the 3. So I don't know how much the guard staggering is going to impact or be tied to DeRozan.
This question's loaded because of how the offseason unfolded, but were you surprised? I think in retrospect, seeing how the offseason unfolded, it's not a surprise that early bird rights were enough to keep Malik Monk. But given how quickly that news came that he was staying with the Kings, did that, because it felt like a lot of people were just penciling, no, that's not the 4 years and 76. That's not going to be enough to keep him. So were you pleasantly surprised that he's actually back?
Yes and no. I always felt strangely comfortable that he was likely to stay. And really that just came down to there weren't that many teams with the space to offer more. And I thought the biggest threat was Orlando. That was the big unknown. I just wasn't sure if they would want to throw that big a contract in the current CBA environment at one guy. I thought they'd kind of try to split it up, and they ended up just basically throwing it at KCP and then running it back with all their guys. But so I was happily surprised when the announcement came before free agency. That was the surprise for me, was that he locked that in even before the draft. I thought that was the big surprise. I thought he would at least go out and test the market, and it'd be a few days of drama as we waited to see if some team would step up with an offer. I always thought there was a pretty good chance he would come back, but I was really shocked that he took it before even actually hitting free agency.
That ended up being one of the few predictions I got right, was that he was going to be back, because I didn't see, you mentioned Orlando was the only team that I could see throwing money at him, and I just didn't think they would do that. But he sort of might have been the harbinger for just dudes that maybe you thought were going to get a lot of money didn't, because that news comes before free agency. And then you look at just all the other, I call it weird stuff that happened, where it's Simone Fontecchio got $8 million and Malik Beasley got $6 million, and Gary Trent Jr.'s on the minimum, and just such a bizarre offseason, which I think probably worked out in the Kings' favor at this point. Does Malik Monk's role shift at all, though, following the addition of DeRozan?
I wouldn't expect a big change. I think it's going to be pretty similar. I think he's still going to be in that sixth man role. I still think that he's likely to be in there in late game situations more often than not. So I think it's going to be pretty similar. I think the biggest difference is just if he's not having a great night, there's less pressure to still keep him in crunch time, because you have other crunch time options with DeRozan now.
You mentioned Keegan Murray kind of developing offensively last year. The way he played on defense just forced me to recalibrate what I think this player can actually become. That dude, especially before the emergence of Keon Ellis, guarded everybody, and it was just absurd. What stood out most to you, or was most impressive about I would call it a defensive leap he made last year?
It was a leap, absolutely. I mean, just from what we expected when he was drafted to what he even showed as a rookie, it was a night and day difference what he was able to do last season. I mean, he was guarding everyone from smaller guys like Steph to bigger guys down low. He was guarding LeBron. I mean, so he was guarding 1 to 4.
John Collins was his center at one point. He was guarding John Collins in the game I was watching. Everybody.
Yeah, just whoever you want to throw him at. All right, there you go. He can go lock him up. And him having that gear, I mean, I didn't see it coming at all, but it completely changes his value and what he can be for the Kings long term, because his size, his offensive ability, his shooting, that was valuable. That was good. But if people had known that he was going to be this good a defender as well, I think the Kings would have taken a lot less flack for taking him third. Right. I think it would have been a little bit more should he be 1? Should he be 2? No worse than 3. I think that conversation would have been a little bit different, but that was one of my favorite surprises of last season, is just how good he was defensively, and just using his length, using his body, his positioning, because he's a really smart guy. He's got good size. I don't think he'll ever be among the elite, just from I shouldn't say that, because I didn't think he'd ever be able to stay in front of Steph, and he did it last season. So what do I know? But I don't know that his foot speed will ever allow him to be the absolute cream of the crop defensively, but he's a very, very good defender, and it definitely flew under the radar last season.
I think even some of the stuff he covered up for around the basket,
Mhm.
not as like a primary rim protector, but as a helper or someone coming like
Yes.
recovering. I'm not going to predict this, but like I just won't rule out like all defense for him at some point. I mean, that one of the 10 best defenders in the league is like a pretty high bar, but if you just watched him at all, like you could just chop her in for like a
Mhm.
game or two and you'd be like, holy fuck. Like this kid, and I did not see like I guess you might have saw hints of it as a rookie, but
Mhm.
I was in like flabbergasted by it for basically the entire year. And everything I wrote about the Kings was like it had to be the Keegan Murray defensive leap was like the qualifier because it was I still am so speechless over it. And so I don't even know what his ceiling is now. And I do wonder, you already touched upon this with the offense, like his role is probably going to be, if you want to call it more streamlined or a little bit marginalized, he does at least play a way where he could still score like
Mhm.
18, 20 points a game doing that. And if he's comfortable, maybe not being on the ball as much, if you look at it through the lens of how much of the defensive workload he's ferrying, that might actually be a good thing for
Yeah.
him. Just because if they're gonna continue to ask him to basically do everything he did last year, even if Keon
Mhm.
Ellis is playing a ton. So I wonder if that helps. But then you run into the issues of like, well, is he gonna want like a bigger offensive role at some point? And do you think he's capable of one? Like you mentioned some of the shot creation stuff he saw last year. Do you think in a vacuum that's a part of his game that he does stand to broaden?
I think he definitely is capable of it as far as just his ability to score. I mean, he can score at all three levels. He showed an ability to score off the dribble. He can obviously catch and shoot. I think the biggest thing with him being a bigger offensive force is just that's not his mentality. Like he's not the guy who's like, I need to get mine, and sometimes I think you need a little bit of that to be a
Yeah.
really good offensive player. So I think he's perfectly fine, and I don't expect there to be issues if he doesn't have a bigger offensive role. He'll just be like, all right. Like he's just like the most mellow and chill dude, and he'll just go out there and drop 20 and all right, let's go. And so I think he's capable of much more, but I don't think he'll have an issue with taking a step back. Like, I mean, if the team needs him to do more, I think he will. I think he'll just kind of do whatever's asked and do it well.
Uh, do you think he might be the next like ball litmus test when his extension comes around next year and it's like just a no brainer max and there will be some people
Oh
that
yeah.
are like sticker shock. Maybe he has like such a huge year, but he dropped what was it 45 last year, and I feel like that wasn't something that was talked
Yeah.
about too much. So he might be one of the next ball litmus tests, Keegan Murray.
Oh yeah. There's gonna be people that like gasp at his extension, and it's just gonna be the rookie max. Like pencil it in now. It's done.
Or
Like
wait for like, I don't know, OG Anunoby's gonna have like a huge game for the next. Be like, I just don't know why the Kings wouldn't have traded Keegan Murray for
yeah.
him.
Yeah. The all the discussions about like, well, so and so, the Kings are interested, but I'm told they won't trade Keegan. It's like, yeah, they're not trading Keegan. Like,
I
they're
I will probably guarantee you though that before the start of last season, I probably said that I would have given up Keegan Murray for OG Anunoby, like when he was still on the Raptors. And so
Mhm.
that is definitely, if anyone has receipts, I'm sure that is something I said, to be fair.
Yeah.
Uh, Keon Ellis, deflection king, pun
Yes.
intended. Holy shit. What did you make of kind of just his emergence and how like big of an impact did he have on a Kings defense that ranked sixth in points allowed per possession from March 1st on, which is I think he made his first start on March 1st of the season.
Yeah, his insertion into the starting lineup was the turning point where suddenly the Kings were like a not just a passable, but an actually good defensive team. It was such a fun moment for him to just kind of come out of nowhere and not just be a defensive guy. I mean, he was capable of contributing on offense. He shot well from three. Like, obviously, still kind of a small sample size. So there is a little bit of that question, like how much of that is going to sustain. But if he can be the player he was at the end of last year, that's huge for the Kings because between Keon Ellis and Keegan Murray, you now have two really good defenders who can guard a variety of positions. And that helps cover up a lot of things. The other thing was that once he got in, like his intensity and his effort seemed to push De'Aaron Fox defensively, and Fox was playing much better defense as well. And maybe it's just like knowing that the guy next to you is going to do his job too, and it's not going to like your effort's not going to be wasted.
Right.
But like Fox is a capable defender. Like he's not a turnstile by any means. So like two really good defenders, and then Fox who can play good defense. Like suddenly you're in a much better spot than the way people traditionally think about the Kings defensively.
Do we know if, I mean, I could have Googled this, but do we know if Keon Ellis, did he play football when he was in school at all?
I do not know.
Some of the steals that he had as like catches would just like reminded me of watching a football game, whether
Yeah.
it was like a wide out or
Oh
like
yeah.
someone in the secondary.
Yeah.
So, just say he's super fun. There are some players that are fun to watch on defense because it's not like sexy all the time to watch it. He's one of those guys. Like he was super fun. And so what do you, his role on this team this year, would you expect him to stay in the starting lineup where it's kind of like Fox, Ellis, and DeRozan, or are we penciling in Kevin Huerter for that starting 2 spot? Like, what would you think?
I would hope it's Keon Ellis. I mean, I think that especially given how much Mike Brown has talked about the importance of playing defense and contributing defensively and effort and disruption, like all the things he's preached about the need for defense to be there as well. Like I have a hard time seeing him then be like, all right, this good defensive guard I found now has to go back to the bench for Kevin Huerter. Like there is that little bit of like, well, do you lose your spot because you were injured? Like Kevin Huerter got hurt and now he's out, but like he was kind of on the way out anyway. Like he was playing pretty limited minutes. Like he was getting kind of the quick hook if he wasn't having a good night. So I I feel like it should be Keon Ellis, and then Kevin Huerter can play a little bit low pressure off the bench, can still get plenty of minutes with catching passes from Sabonis, can kind of play alongside Monk. Like he can find ways to kind of find his groove again. But I do think that it should be Keon Ellis until proven otherwise. Like if Keon Ellis comes out and turns back into a pumpkin, like yeah, make the switch. Like we don't need to stick with it too long. But I think he showed enough that he deserves the opportunity to stay as the starter.
I wondered after the Devin Carter injury news if it made it less likely that Keon Ellis would start because you wanted some of like the defensive punch to come off the bench, and like Jalen McDaniels is, I mean, he's Jalen McDaniels, and so, but I would start Keon Ellis personally. Even just, I think that would probably end up being their best 5-man unit. Maybe there's some fussing and fiddling when you include Monk in some of them. So I think he should start, especially. And you mentioned the stuff about Mike Brown, who like seems to revolt against this idea that the Kings need to be offense, offense, offense. So that would fit with that motif. How sustainable, though, do you view? And I'm not saying they need to be a top 6 defensive team, but that close to the season, because it's March. There's a lot of noise in March. We all shout out Jalen Green, March All-Star. But like when you look at what they were doing, and they weren't getting a lucky, like when you look at the opponent shooting numbers, they didn't get lucky there. So how, when you're looking at the Kings saying their ability to be, let's say, an above average defensive team, how sustainable do you view, or realistic do you view that goal to be?
I think it depends a lot on if the shift in officiating that we saw mid-season last year stays. Because the Kings were a huge beneficiary of that. Just the way that they play defense is more physical and kind of poking and prodding and trying to get steals, which led to a lot of dumb fouls under the way the refs were calling the game at the start of the season, and turned into a lot of like flustering opponents and getting steals and getting fast break points after the adjustment. So it's like, if that kind of new style officiating is here to stay, I think the Kings can still be that good defensively. If it goes back to the way it had been, maybe not so much. Like they might get in some foul trouble again. Like I do think that they were a big beneficiary of that change. So it feels like a cop-out answer, but I think a lot of it does depend on just how the game is being called.
I'll be fascinated to see how the game is being officiated to start.
Like league-wide, I think it's going to be interesting to see, because that's a big difference for everyone.
That whole
some teams are better than others, but
that whole shift was super awkward too, because you had the NBA like basically in an official statement saying, well, it was like it was a conscious decision, but it really wasn't, and it was just like it was just so awkward. So
it's like, no, we didn't change anything, and then like a month later, it's like, well, we had some conversations. Like
so awkward. Kevin Huerter, I won't rule out a bounce back here from him, but he's had like a rough go basically since the playoffs of what year is that? 2023.
Yeah.
Now coming off of shoulder surgery too. Where do you view his future on this team? Is like, we already got into, will he be coming off the bench or not? And look, the type of shooting and scoring he brings is absolutely valuable. But when you look at what this team has now, do you envision him being his value coming maybe as salary matching in a trade more so than someone who is contributing to this actual team?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm kind of surprised he's still on the team. I thought he
Huh?
was going to be traded this summer. I think you hook him up to a lie detector. I think he was surprised that he's still here at the end of the summer. Like, I think that everyone kind of expected, like, all right, we've kind of done this. It hasn't worked out. Like, you kind of hit that slump. You just get to a fresh scenery. Like, I don't think it's hard feelings or anything. I think it's just for whatever reason he's struggling in a slump, in a bad spot, unhappy, whatever it might be. Um, I would be surprised if he's on the team after the trade deadline, but it's Monty McNair. So, sometimes guys stick around for 2 years longer than I think they're going to. Uh, Shout out Harrison Barnes. So, it's hard to say. I do hope he can bounce back and kind of show that he's still that elite shooter, because that obviously is very beneficial for the Kings and a huge, huge part of what made that run 2 years ago so special was his shooting along with everything else that kind of fell in line that year. So I'm hoping for a bounce back, but I also feel like it's kind of on borrowed time and just kind of wait and see when he moves on.
And I guess if you're the King, you probably are at least hoping you can rehabilitate his trade value a little bit,
Mhm.
because his contract looks a little bit steeper now than it did before, where I would still he seems I don't know what the word would be, but like I would absolutely be trading for Kevin Huerter if I'm a team that needs any sort of shooting and rolling the dice on that. And I think Kings fans, at least from what I've seen, seem obsessed with the idea of some sort of like Kevin Huerter for Dorian Finney-Smith constructional trade. So that could be somewhat interesting for the Kings. The version of peak Kevin Huerter is just so good, that if
Mhm.
you are looking to really lean into the offensive identity, like you have him and Malik Monk coming off the bench, like that's kind of just stupid.
Yeah. Like, it could be fantastic. It could work out great. It just depends. Yeah, I think one of the other question marks with Herder is just, can he be as efficient and effective coming off the bench? He's a guy who kind of seems to do better with starting and kind of getting his rhythm right away. So I'm curious to see if he can adjust to that role. I don't think his contract's that bad though. I mean, he's at like basically 17 this year, 18 the next, and
Mhm.
then that's it. And in the modern cap, I don't think that that's too steep a price, especially if he can regain his shooting. He's still young. He's 26. So, I think that there's plenty of upside still there for him. Um, and hopefully he can bounce back and make us all look like fools for suggesting he'd be on the bench.
And he's supposed to be ready for the start of the season, right? There's not going to be any like
Yeah,
delay. Okay.
yeah, he's not in any sort of brace at this point. They're at least not that's been reported. Teams aren't always the best about medical updates in the offseason, but as far as anyone knows, he's supposed to be back for the start of the season.
Someone who won't be Devin Carter.
Yes.
Um, what do you make of, before we get into the health stuff and if he even would play this season? What do you have any early impressions of his game, or like what theoretical his fit would look like here?
So I'll preface this by saying I was not a big Devin Carter fan going into the draft, so I was a little disappointed that they picked him, and then he got hurt, and then he needed surgery. He's going to miss most of his rookie year, so I'm not super high on that in general. Um, I see the vision though. I mean, a guy who is a very active and smart defender, a guy with really good length and disruptive. He's basically the. I see the idea being, okay, bigger Davion Mitchell. Like, Davion Mitchell didn't work out because he wasn't big enough, didn't have the length. Like, okay, we'll get a guy who's a bigger version of that. That's the hope. I have some questions. I feel like, my personal opinion, I don't feel like he's quite polished enough, given that he is an older rookie.
Mhm.
I don't watch a lot of college ball, so I always caveat my draft takes with saying, like, they're done with minimal research and just kind of early first impressions and just little things I noticed when watching highlight tapes. But like, I noticed a lot of these like defensive highlights where him like getting burned and like recovering for a block. It's like, well, that's great at college, but like, that's easier against an 18-year-old than an NBA pro. I'm a little concerned about how that's going to work out long term, but yeah, I'm hoping he proves me wrong. I always want guys to prove me wrong when I'm down on them, but um, yeah, it's frustrating that he's going to miss so much of the year, because I would have loved to have been proven wrong early on, but now I've got kind of this lingering bad feeling hanging over.
From what little I've dug into him with, I find myself being more sold on the offensive progress he made last year
Mhm.
translate into the NBA than the stuff he can do defensively. I'm wondering if the NBA, like speed and spacing, could hurt him there. And if it doesn't, my colleague Jonathan Wasserman said like his peak outcome could be like a Derek White. And I sort of see that then. I just have it's weird
Yeah.
that he build because he was drafted like the whole thing surrounding him coming out of the draft was his defense, defense, defense. And then when I'm
Mhm.
just watching him and I'm like, that's probably the question I have of wonder whether it'll translate. But if it does, I think he has a chance to be like a heck of sort of like a connective type of player, which would be, and it's always tough to envision them on teams that are supposed to be really good. I never know
Mhm.
how much they're actually going to lean on rookies. Like the Grizzlies are kind of in weird uncharted territory. Like Zach Edey's just going to start, I guess, and play a
Yeah.
shit ton of minutes, and that's an objectively weird spot to be if you're a team that's hoping to be top 4 in the West.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard that comp too, like kind of a ceiling or kind of a best case outcome is kind of a Derek White type, and I think that would be fantastic. The Kings could have every team in the league could use a Derek
I was
White
about to
type,
say, oh,
right?
you think it's okay
Yeah,
to have Derek White on your
yeah,
team?
yeah. Like I'm not breaking any news here. Like that's a good thing. So I would love that to be the outcome. But realistically, also just given his time frame to come back, like we're probably going to see very little of him this year. If we do, it's going to be like March. So I'm not expecting much this year, and hopefully next year be healthy, go through camp, and we'll see what he brings.
Yeah, that's kind of I mean, the injuries are a bummer regardless, but because you're a rookie and the
Yeah,
Kings have immediate aspirations, like let's just say he's ready by January or February. It's like, well, they're not going to just integrate him midstream when they're in the middle of like a postseason seeding
right,
battle. And so
right.
I'm hoping he plays this year, but I just can't imagine he's going to be. Whereas at least before it was kind of like maybe they would give him a shot. But if he's not going to be ready and like be able to go through a training camp with them, I just find it hard to imagine he'll play any type of like role on this team as a rookie.
Yeah, the only hope is that the Kings are good enough that they have like a ton of blowout wins
Right.
at that time of year so that he can get thrown into garbage time in like a winning situation. Like that'd be great. That way we can kind of get a glimpse of him. But
So, De'Aaron Fox and Domas Sabonis are boring in the sense that we know what they are now, and so, like, I can't do the whole, like, normal player deep dive that we do with these guys, so this is my question to you. Why is it we're however many years removed from the Domas Sabonis, why is he still such a polarizing player? Literally anything involving him, whether it's the contract, the trade itself, like, the bruises or marks on his face, like, it just everything about him just feels like it incites division. And it's if you're talking about a big, like a young up and coming big who can do stuff with the ball, it feels like people's normal pot shot, they gravitate to like, yeah, he's gonna be better than Domas Sabonis. Like, who would you rather have, Alperen Şengün or Domas Sabonis? And so I find that without taking a stance, I just find it, I guess, is it morbidly intriguing? Like, what makes him so divisive?
yeah, I was thinking about a lot about that last season just because we saw a lot of the vitriol, especially people kind of having a backlash to his like double streak. Like there like a lot of people were very angry about that being talked about online. So it kind of made me think about like, okay, what is it that people don't like? And I think if I kind of take my Kings fan hat off, I think there's two things that he does that make people not like him.
It looks like he's wearing a toupee. Is that one?
That's not one of them. So there's
Oh.
three things. So the first is that he is a very physical player. Like he loves setting hard screens. He definitely like leans into them from time to time, like most guys do. But I mean, he's a big, strong, like physical player and plays very physical. And I think opposing fans think he gets away with stuff. And then on the other end, he does get hit a lot, but he also reacts like he's dying like every time he gets hit. Like, and I think if you're a very physical player who's like laying the hurt on people on one end and then like getting upset that someone like grazed your head on the other end, like I could see where that could irk some people. Like I think that that's my leading theory on why he bothers folks. Um, because yeah, it's I think, and then kind of the more tinfoil hat theory is that there's a lot of people that don't like him because they had very strong takes on the Sabonis Halliburton trade, and when both teams are good, it makes those takes look bad, and so they kind of take it out on Sabonis.
Will he take more than 100 total 3-pointers this year, though? That is also my other question on him. He's been at 83 and 87 respectively in Sacramento his first two full seasons.
I'm going to say yes then. I was
I'm
going to
gonna
look
say
up
he
the number.
better.
I was going to look at the number. I think yes, and I think it's because of that. Like, if you're going to have DeRozan in your starting lineup, like, you need to still have spacing, right? Like, you're going to have spacing from Fox, who shot the three at a decent clip. You still have Huerter and Monk, and kind of mix guys in there. Keon Ellis can shoot decent threes, but like, if you're losing that Harrison Barnes floor stretching element, replacing it with DeRozan, like, you need a little more spacing from somewhere. And 13 extra threes from Sabonis, I could see that.
The Kings themselves have not done a ton or even really any midseason maneuvering since that Sabonis trade. When
Very
you look
aware,
at
yeah.
just the circumstances right now, you get a 35-year-old DeMar DeRozan. You have to start thinking about Keegan Murray's next contract. De'Aaron Fox could be Supermax eligible after this season. You've already paid Sabonis. Do you think that there will be more of an urgency to upgrade things on the fly now?
I certainly hope so. Monte McNair has been very disciplined, is the way I'll put it, is that he kind of has an idea of what a player is worth. And if the market isn't giving it, he just holds on to his player, which is good to a point. It helps you from getting fleeced. But at a certain point, you turn into Masai Ujiri, where you're just holding on to your pieces forever and never doing anything. And then, like, you kind of watch things fall apart around you and guys walk away for nothing. And so, like, it's such a fine line to walk between, like, don't make a move just to make a move. But there's times when it's like, no, you need to make a move. And when I look at this Kings roster construction, like, there's a lot of good pieces. It's not a perfectly meshed and pieces all fit together perfectly. Like, there's obviously some concerns there. And I would really hope that they find a way to make a move to balance out the roster.
Yeah, I remember being aggravated them at this past trade deadline, and this is so stupid at grand scheme of things. But I was like, why were they just not the Royce O'Neal team then? If that's all it cost to get him, I'm not even like go out there and make a blockbuster move. Just make a
Yeah.
fucking move and not Kessler Edwards or somebody along those lines.
Yeah. No, Royce O'Neal was one of the targets I really wanted at the deadline. It's really frustrating because there's all these guys that you're like, that's the guy we need. Go get him. They don't go get him. And like, the common excuse is like, well, it takes two, and maybe the other teams just don't want what you have, and it's like, okay, but at a certain point, you just gotta make things happen. Like, so it gets tiring. Like, PJ Washington was a guy that I really wanted at the deadline last year, and it's like, oh, turns out he can help a team that wants to make a push towards the playoffs. Like, who knew? Like, so not to say I'm always right. There's plenty of those that I want, and then they don't help their team do anything at all. So, but it would be nice to see them make a midseason move. Again, I think Kevin Huerter is the obvious candidate. Like, that's a solid salary for matching purposes, and I would hope that they can make a move that can really kind of balance the roster and address weaknesses all at the same time.
Are you ready to enter the cookie cutter portion of this podcast?
Always. I love
Are you
cookies.
also ready to accept your award that I don't know what it'll be with the intro in there, but I think this is number 14 in the Lookahead series so far this season. It's the first time we got to the cookie cutter portion under 45 minutes. So,
oh man,
you. Hats off.
I am not known for my brevity, so that's
BS. All your podcasts with me have been. You really don't like talking to me then, because they're always so efficient with the knowledge that you're dropping. You're just trying to get out of here as quickly as possible.
All right, we done?
Yeah, we're gonna fuck the cookie cutter portion. So the two basic questions. We begin with the first one. Is there anything about this team that's flying under the radar in terms of like strengths or just development you'll be watching that doesn't receive enough national attention?
I mean, under the radar, I think we've already kind of covered it. I mean, it's Keegan Murray, Keon Ellis, like that defensive duo is really strong, and I don't think that they get enough credit. I think a lot of people had kind of penciled in, they knew what the Kings were, as a playing team towards the end of last season, and so they kind of missed what happened with Keon Ellis, missed a lot of what was going on with Keegan Murray as the season went along. So I think that's still under the radar, and hopefully the Kings will be good enough to get some folks to notice that this year.
when you are looking at the roster, the Kings are interesting because you mentioned this before. They have so many individually talented players, but so few that I would like say approach completeness, where it's like I look at Keegan Murray and he could be that guy. Darren Fox might already be that guy. But then it's like when you look at everybody else, it feels like there are these really big flaws or voids in their game that you would like them to fill. So when you're looking at this roster, what is your biggest concern or biggest need for it that you think they're going to ultimately have to address this season?
I think the biggest need is still the same issue that they had all of last year that really hurt them, and that's just size. You know, they have Keegan Murray's likely going to start at the 4. Trey Lyles is a very good backup forward. That's pretty much it. Behind
Alex
Sabonis.
Len erasure right there. What's going on?
What's that?
No Alex Len? No, are we erasing him?
I love Alex Len, but like you've got Sabonis and Alex Len, and Alex Len is a very good backup, but he's situational and plays limited minutes. Like you don't want to rely on Alex Len for more than like 10 minutes a game. And I really like Keegan Murray. I really like Trey Lyles, but like that's it. You don't have anyone else big. Like, all due respect to Jalen McDaniels, who I'm not real high on, but I mean, they don't have size, and there's certain teams you just need bigger guys against, and so I'd love to see that get addressed. Like, even if it's just a bench guy, but it's someone that you can throw out there to give you size when you need it. I think the Kings still really lack that. They have a lot of guys who are on the smaller side.
And would you prefer that size to come in the form of someone who can play with Sabonis, or is it more you'd be fine if that's like, I kind of thought if they would just relative to the minutes that his body can clearly handle if he's healthy, they seemed like an interesting. How much would it cost to get RW3 out of Portland as just like sort of soak up some of those backup 5 minutes and he's not huge, but he plays huge. But would you prefer like you're more so targeting, you think it's someone that needs to be able to play alongside Sabonis in the front court?
I would say alongside. So when I'm looking at for size, I'm actually looking more at like the 3 and 4 spot as opposed to the center spot. Yeah, an upgrade at the backup center would also be fantastic. But I mean, Sabonis does soak up the minutes. He's been durable. Kind of knock on wood on that. But but more concerned around kind of the 4 and the 3 spot.
So when this team is fully healthy, what does the top 10 rotation look like?
So, I mean, Fox, Monk, DeRozan, Keegan Murray, Sabonis. I should have been paying attention to who I said there.
So those are 5 locks. I think Ellis is definitely would be
Keon
a
Ellis, Kevin Huerter, Trey Lyles.
That's 8.
And then I'd say Alex Len and Jordan McLaughlin.
Oh, okay. So no, Jalen McDaniel's not a part of the plans. Then that's actually a good thing to hear.
I do not think he's. They didn't even do an introductory press conference when they traded for him. I don't think he's part of the plan at all.
Probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Judging off my experience. So this is actually an interesting question for this team, and I know it'll be matchup dependent sometimes. What do you think will end up being their most used crunch time lineup? Excuse me.
I think it will be situationally dependent because I think the way you roll out that lineup is going to depend on if you're ahead and trying to protect a lead or if you're behind and trying to play catch up. But I think that most common you're going to see. See, I'm looking at the line. I'm looking at the roster. I'm trying to figure out what they're even going to do. I think that most likely you're probably still going to be looking at like Fox, Monk, DeRozan, Keegan, and Sabonis. But I think there's going to be times when you just have to have Ellis in there for the defense. And it's like, okay, who do you take off? Do you take off Monk? Do you take off DeRozan? Do you take off Keegan?
Do you think that's something they'll consider? Because I think when you look at the cachet Sabonis and DeRozan and Fox have, you would think those would be 3 players that are just penciled in as locks for the crunch time unit. And yet DeRozan specifically feels like someone where when you're looking at the situation of the matchup, like that might be a spot you should be a little bit more malleable with.
Yeah, and I think it's gonna depend on matchups as well as just how that game has gone. I mean, we've seen with Mike Brown in the past where he was perfectly fine sitting Monk in close games where Monk had been having just a bad game. Like if someone else was playing well, he's happy to ride the hot hand even in crunch time. So I think it will be heavily dependent on who's playing well that night, what's the matchup, what's the situation. I don't think it's going to be every I don't think you're going to see 70 games of the same closing lineup. I think there's going to be some variability, but I think that it's going to be some combination of those 6 guys. So Fox, Monk, Keon Ellis, DeRozan, Keegan, Sabonis. I just don't know who the odd man out is going to be night to night.
Is there a funky, weird, quirky lineup you would like to see Mike Brown try this season?
I do think it'd be fun to see like the 4 guards. So Fox, Ellis, Monk, and DeRozan all playing at the same time. Probably going to have like Alex Len in there so that there's some sort of backstop for you. But I think that'd be fun just to kind of go all guards.
I think I would pick the same, but it's time to put the Keegan Murray's already proven he can do stuff. It's time to put him at center.
Keegan at center. The super small lineup.
You're worried about size, and the Kings they'll lean right into it. Tallest player on the court is, what is he, 6'8"? That'll be the tallest player
6'8".
on the court. So as we are recording this, their over-under is set at 46.5. Mm-hmm. I have a 2-part question to this. Are you taking the over or the under on that?
Taking the over.
Okay. That is only one game to hit the over. It's only one game more than last season. If you add DeRozan and factor in maybe better health, even in next year's West, that doesn't seem all that ridiculous.
Yeah.
Which teams, though, are you prepared? You have to put on, you might have to take off your Kings hat again for this. I want to ask you, what are the teams that you would be most confident in saying they're going to be better than Sacramento next year in the West?
Oof. That is tricky.
I can give you the ones I'm prepared to guarantee if that'll help you at all.
Sure.
I think OKC will be better.
I'm good with that. Yeah.
I think Minnesota will be better.
Yeah, probably.
I am absurdly high on Dallas next year. And I'm trying to I feel like I've been a little overly pessimistic on them, but I still throw the Nuggets into there. Mm-hmm. And that's where my guarantees would end. And so like if you told me Sacramento was 4th, I would believe you. I think they're more likely to settle into like the 5th or 6th spot, though, is where I would have them right now.
Yeah, I think that, history tells us that one of those 4 likely falls out of the top 4.
Calvin Booth, better hope it's not the Nuggets.
The top 4 just, especially in the West, just does not stay the same. Like it changes every year. We tend to think like who was good last year will be good again this year, and it just like obviously there's some level of consistency, but it tends to change in surprising ways. Like one injury is enough in the West to like knock you 5 spots down the pecking order. So I would agree that like based on current lineups, based on health, like all of that, like those 4, I'd be pretty comfortable saying, yeah, those are very likely better than the Kings this year. And then there's a bunch of teams that's like, well, they could be or they might not be. So yeah, I think your 4 is a good. That's probably what I would have come up with as well. I think Dallas is probably one of the bigger question marks, mostly just because I don't trust Jason Kidd. Like,
Mavs didn't until the middle of last year, so
I still don't think they should. I mean, they played phenomenal after the deadline and their acquisitions. Like, you look at what that pace would have been. Like, they would have been much higher up and all that. But I think that regular season, kind of the ins and outs, I could see them a little bit lower. If I was going to bet on one of those 4 to slip out, it'd be them or Denver. But
it's also the West is fucked because it's like Phoenix is just floating around out there. And if you told me Phoenix finished 9th, I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. If you told me they finished 1st, I'd be like, yeah, like
sure.
The West is just, so wild. So that's what makes it even tougher. But I do think we haven't done our over-unders yet. I do think I'm leaning towards over on the Kings just because it's an extra win compared to last year. And I do think they're better and that they'll be healthier. And I also do believe, I don't know if I said this, I do think they're going to make a midseason move this year. Like, I think the urgency has to be ingrained into how they act. And it's fine to be like, we're not going to make it now. We want to see what this looks like. And that's okay, sure. But it's like, if stuff isn't like working or clicking, like now's not the time to just ride this out. Like you've done that now. And so I do believe that they will make a move that we're talking about at the trade deadline, not like one of those cutesy, like, oh, whatever, like bookkeeping moves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very likely. I mean, I think they have too many cards not to do something. Again, barring injuries. I mean, injuries could shake that all out to where it's like, all right, we don't need to make a trade. But
I don't want to galaxy brain this, but is there like any chance we're talking about Kevin Huerter? Is there any chance just because of his value in a vacuum and now what they have on the roster that Malik Monk is just on the table once the restriction lifts?
I'd be very surprised.
Okay.
I'd be very surprised. Like that type of move, I think, would shake up that locker room in a way that I don't think the front office feels the need to at this point in time. Like the vibes in the locker room with the fan base, like that'd be a ballsy move that could like make or break Monty McNair's remaining time in Sacramento.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Is there anything else or anyone else on this team about this team we haven't discussed that you think we need to touch upon?
I mean, I think
you want to get into Mike Brown extension negotiations or
no, I'm just glad that got done. That was so stupid. It was like the dumbest leaks coming out, like trying to spin narratives. Like,
was it a full like day before it was just okay? Yeah. Like it was done after it was a full day. Yeah. I thought it was for some reason in my head. I thought it was hours.
No, it was like, yeah, they tried to play hardball through the media, like buckled a day later. Like it was so dumb. No, I think the only thing I would say is that we talked a little about Sabonis and why people don't like him. We talked a little bit about Fox and kind of the fit and all that, but I think it's worth kind of closing on just like how good those two have become and how consistent they are for Sacramento. And like I said, that's a little boring. It doesn't make for, good sports talk, but they have been just so good. Like, I was just kind of looking at numbers and like, I want to caveat this with like, Shea is like a way better. He is a better player than Fox. I fully concede that. Like, but like Fox is not that far off. Like you look like category by category, he's like not that far off. Like he is worse. I'm not trying to argue he's better or anything like that, but like just the difference in how Shea gets talked about versus Fox, like does not align with like where their numbers are and what they do. And like Fox is getting where he's underrated based on what he's doing year over year right now.
I will say I'm not a big believer in agendas unless I'm the one that's creating them. Like I just tend to believe that when people think that an outlet has an agenda against their team, as someone who works for a very big national outlet, I can just confirm that's not the way things work. But I do have my own agenda, so that's fair.
Yeah.
Relative to being just two guys who in any given season can just be on an all-NBA team and no one's going to bat an eye at it, Fox and Sabonis don't seem like they get enough credit. And I don't know what goes into that specifically. I mean, we already talked about with Sabonis, but like Fox has been basically really good since the Sabonis trade. Like that unlocked something in him. So I will side with you on that it does feel like those two don't get talked about. And I don't know, is it just like, oh, we need to see them win a playoff series to get like, is that we kind of like almost similar to what Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum went through, except like they made it to the finals and lost, and people use that against them as like flatters, like why this couldn't work. They lost in the finals. They were second of 30 teams. So I would agree with you there. I think that's fair. Those two are really good. I still think Fox is noticeably more important than Sabonis. And I actually think that I actually think I picked Sabonis to make an all-NBA team though over him last year. So maybe I should look, this is just me forgetting what I'm saying, but I'm a big believer in De'Aaron Fox. Greg, are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the work that you help put out or sometimes put out yourself? When you drop the link, I will click if I know that you wrote it.
Yeah, so I'm managing editor at kingsherald.com. We're independent Kings coverage, so you can check us out there. And then I'm on Twitter at GWIS, GWISS. And during basketball season, I'll talk about basketball there. Otherwise, it's me just retweeting dumb jokes.
Which I'll know it's you too. Like before I even see your tweet, it's like, this tweet is from like 2017 and it's funny. Oh, that's Greg. That's who put it on my feed.
Yep. You're welcome.
Well, thank you for coming on the podcast once again. As you know by now, I'll be pestering you again in the future, and I will try to limit the profanity that I hurl at you in the direct messages, and I won't call you names this season, I promise.
If you do, I'll probably have deserved it. So